There is a moment in every man's life when the whole world tells him he is nothing. They laugh at him. They look through him like he is made of glass. They say his name and shake their heads. They say he will never make it. They say he is too quiet, too simple, too ordinary. And in that moment, a man has only two choices. He can believe them and walk away. Or he can swallow every word they said, let it burn inside his chest like a fire that never goes out, and use that pain to become something the world has never seen before. This is the story of a man who chose the fire. A man who was laughed at, ignored, mocked, and pushed to the edge. A man who was called just another sniper by people who did not understand what he carried inside him. And this is the story of the day a United States Navy SEAL Admiral stood up from his chair, walked across a room full of the most dangerous warriors on the planet, and saluted him before anyone else could even move. But to understand that moment, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to a small, broken town where nobody expected anything good to come from. He was born in a place most people would never find on a map. A small town in the American South where the summers were so hot the roads would crack and the winters were cold enough to freeze the pipes inside the walls of the old houses. His family did not have much. His father worked long hours at a factory that made parts for machines. His mother cleaned houses for families who had more money than they did. They were not poor in the way that people in cities sometimes imagine poor to be. They had food on the table most nights. They had a roof that only leaked when the storms were really bad. But they did not have extras. There were no vacations. There were no new shoes at the start of school. There were no birthday parties with balloons and cake and all the kids from the neighborhood. His childhood was simple and hard and quiet. He was the middle child. He had an older brother who was loud and strong and always getting into trouble, and a younger sister who was sweet and shy and always reading books. He was the one in the middle who nobody really noticed. His brother took up all the space in the room with his voice and his energy. His sister took up all the attention with her grades and her gentle smile. And he just existed somewhere in between, like a shadow that moved along the wall but never made a sound. His teachers at school would sometimes forget his name. They would call him by his brother's name or just say, "Hey you," when they needed him to do something. He was not bad at school, but he was not great either. He passed his classes. He did his homework. He sat in the back of the room and watched the clock and waited for the bell to ring. But there was one thing about him that was different from everyone else. One thing that nobody noticed at first. He could be still, not just quiet, not just calm, but completely, perfectly, absolutely still. He could sit in one spot for hours without moving. He could watch something for so long that the rest of the world would disappear around him. When he was a boy, he would go into the woods behind his house and sit on a fallen tree and just watch. He would watch the birds. He would watch the squirrels. He would watch the way the light moved through the leaves as the sun crossed the sky. And he would not move, not even a little. His breathing would slow down. His heartbeat would get quiet. And everything around him would come alive because he was so still that the animals and the insects and even the wind seemed to forget he was there. His father noticed this one day when the boy was about 10 years old. He had been looking for him for almost an hour, calling his name through the trees, getting more and more worried. And then he found him sitting on that same fallen tree, perfectly still, watching a deer that had walked within 10 feet of him. The deer was eating grass and had no idea the boy was there. His father stood at the edge of the trees and watched for a long moment, and something shifted inside him. He did not say anything about it that day. But the next weekend, he took the boy out to an old field behind his uncle's property and handed him a rifle for the first time. The wood on the stock was scratched and worn smooth from years of hands holding it. The metal was dark with age. It was not fancy or expensive, but when the boy held it, something happened. Something clicked inside him like a lock finding its key. His father showed him how to hold it, how to press the stock against his shoulder, how to look through the sights, how to breathe. And then he pointed at a tin can sitting on a fence post about 50 yards away and told the boy to try. The boy looked through the sights. He breathed the way his father showed him. He squeezed the trigger, and the can flew off the post like it had been hit by a truck. His father stared at the empty fence post for a long time. Then he set up another can. The boy hit it again and again and again. 5 cans in a row. Every single one. His father did not make a big deal out of it. He was not the kind of man who made big deals out of things, but he started taking the boy out to that field every Saturday morning. And every Saturday morning the boy got better. He started shooting at smaller targets. Bottles, pieces of wood, rocks balanced on top of fence posts, and he hit them all. By the time he was 12, he could hit a target that most grown men would struggle to see. By the time he was 14, he was the best shot in the county, though hardly anyone knew it because he never talked about it and his family never bragged. High school was not easy for him. He was still the quiet one, the invisible one. He was not big enough for football. He was not fast enough for track. He was not smooth enough to be popular with the girls. He went to school every day and came home every day, and nobody really noticed. His brother had already dropped out and was working at the same factory as their father. His sister was getting scholarships and making plans to go to college, and he was just there, in the middle, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with his life. He thought about joining the military, not because he was patriotic in some big, loud way, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he did not know what else to do. He had no money for college. He had no special skills that anyone could see. He had no connections, no plan, no direction. The military seemed like the only door that was open to someone like him. So in his senior year of high school, he walked into the recruiter's office in the strip mall on the edge of town and sat down across from a man in a uniform and said he wanted to join. The recruiter looked at him the way most people looked at him, like he was nothing special. Like he was just another kid from a small town with no future who was looking for 3 meals a day and a place to sleep. The recruiter asked him what he wanted to do in the military, and the boy said he did not know. The recruiter asked him if he was good at anything, and the boy thought about it for a long time, and then said he was pretty good at shooting. The recruiter smiled the way adults smile at children who say something cute and said that was great. A lot of guys think they are good at shooting. Then the recruiter pushed some papers across the desk and told him to sign. He went through basic training, and it was hard, not because of the physical part. He was thin, but he was tough in a way that did not show on the outside. The running was hard, the push-ups were hard, the obstacle courses were hard, but he got through them. What was harder was the social part. The other recruits were loud and rough and competitive. They formed groups and friendships and rivalries within the first week, and he was on the outside of all of it, the way he had always been on the outside. He did his work. He followed orders. He kept his head down, and nobody paid much attention to him until the day they went to the rifle range for the first time. It was a standard qualification day. Every recruit had to shoot at targets from different distances and score high enough to pass. Most of the recruits were nervous. Some of them had never held a rifle before. The drill instructors were yelling and the pressure was high and hands were shaking. He stepped up to his lane and picked up the rifle, and it was like coming home. The noise around him faded. The yelling faded. The nervousness of the other recruits faded. It was just him and the rifle and the target downrange. He fired his rounds, and when the scores came back, he had hit a perfect score. Not just good, not just excellent. Perfect. Every single round in the center of the target. The drill instructor walked over to him and looked at his target, and then looked at him, and then looked at the target again. He asked the boy where he learned to shoot like that. The boy said his father taught him. The drill instructor nodded slowly and made a note on his clipboard and walked away. That note would change his life, because that note got passed up the chain of command, and somewhere in a building far away, someone read it and decided that this quiet kid from a small town might be exactly what they were looking for. A few weeks later, he was pulled out of his regular unit and told he was being sent to a special training program. They did not tell him much about it at first. They just said it was advanced marksmanship training and that he had been selected based on his performance. He packed his bag and got on a bus and went to a new base where everything was different. The buildings were nicer. The equipment was newer. The men around him were harder and quieter and more serious than anyone he had ever been around. These were not regular soldiers. These were men who had been selected for something specific, something dangerous, something that most people would never know about. The training was brutal. They woke up before the sun, and they did not stop until long after it went down. They ran miles with heavy packs on their backs. They crawled through mud and sand and water. They learned to move without making a sound. They learned to hide in plain sight. They learned to control their breathing, their heartbeat, their body temperature. They learned to go without food and water and sleep for days at a time. And through it all, they shot. They shot every day for hours from every position, in every condition. They shot in the rain and the wind and the heat and the cold. They shot at targets so far away they were barely visible. They shot at night with no light. They shot from rooftops and from holes in the ground and from the backs of moving vehicles. And he was good at all of it. Not just good. He was the best. The instructors started to notice him the way nobody had ever noticed him before. They watched him shoot, and they whispered to each other, and they nodded. But the other trainees did not see what the instructors saw. To them, he was still the quiet kid who did not talk much. He was still the nobody from nowhere. Some of them made fun of him behind his back. They called him names. They said he was boring. They said he was weird for being so quiet all the time. They said he would wash out eventually because he did not have what it takes to be in the real fight. They said shooting was just one skill, and that being a real warrior required so much more than just pulling a trigger.
He had all of it.
Every word, every joke, every whisper behind his back. And he did what he had always done. He said nothing. He showed nothing on his face. He swallowed it all and let it burn inside him like a fire that he fed with every insult, every laugh, every dismissive look. And he trained harder. He woke up earlier than everyone else. He stayed later than everyone else. He practiced when his hands were blistered and bleeding. He ran when his legs felt like they were made of concrete. He pushed himself past the point where most men would have quit. And then he pushed some more. There was one instructor in particular who saw something in him that the others missed. He was an older man, a veteran of many wars, with scars on his hands and a quietness in his eyes that matched the boy's own quietness. This instructor never yelled at him, never pushed him the way he pushed the others. Instead, he would come over to him after a long day of training and sit beside him and talk to him in a low voice. He would tell him stories about missions he had been on, about targets he had hit from impossible distances, about moments when the whole world narrowed down to a single breath and a single squeeze of the trigger, and a single bullet that changed everything. And he would tell the boy that what he had was rare, that the stillness inside him, the ability to shut out the noise and the fear and the doubt and become nothing but focus, that was a gift that most men would never have. The boy listened to these stories and something grew inside him. Not pride exactly, not confidence in the way most people understand confidence, but a deep, quiet knowing, a certainty that he was made for this. That all those years of sitting in the woods, watching, waiting, being still, had been preparing him for something. That the invisibility he had carried his whole life was not a weakness. It was his greatest weapon. He completed the training. He graduated near the top of his class in overall performance and at the very top in marksmanship. He was given his assignment and his team and his first deployment orders. He was going to war, and he was going as a sniper. The thing that people had laughed at, the skill that people had dismissed as just pulling a trigger, he was going to take that skill into the most dangerous places on earth and use it to protect the men beside him. And nobody, not the kids who had ignored him in school, not the recruits who had made fun of him in basic training, not the trainees who had called him boring and weird, none of them had any idea what he was about to become. He shipped out on a cold morning in early spring. The sky was grey and the wind was sharp, and the transport plane was loud and uncomfortable. He sat in his seat with his gear packed tight around him and his rifle case across his knees, and he looked out the small window at the country falling away beneath him. He thought about his father and those Saturday mornings in the field. He thought about his mother and the way she had hugged him at the door and told him to come home safe. He thought about his brother and his sister in the small house with the leaking roof. And then he closed his eyes and let all of it go. He emptied his mind the way he had learned to empty it. He slowed his breathing. He slowed his heart. And he became still. Because where he was going, stillness was the difference between life and death. And he had been practicing for this his entire life without even knowing it. The boy who nobody noticed was about to become the man that nobody could ignore. But it would not happen the way anyone expected. It would happen through blood and fear and impossible choices and moments that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It would happen one bullet at a time, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. And by the time it was over, a SEAL Admiral would stand before him and give him the one thing nobody had ever given him before: respect. But that moment was still a long way off. First, he had to survive. The country he landed in did not look like anything he had ever seen. The air was different. It was thick and dry, and it tasted like dust and something else. Something he could not name but would later understand was the taste of a place that had been at war for longer than he had been alive. The buildings were low and made of stone and clay. The streets were narrow and winding and full of shadows. The mountains in the distance looked like the bones of the earth pushing through the skin of the land. Everything was brown and gold and grey, and the sun hung in the sky like a burning eye that never blinked. His team was small. 8 men, each one of them had been selected for a specific skill. There were breachers who could blow through any door. There were medics who could keep a dying man alive with nothing but tape and pressure and sheer willpower. There were communications experts who could call in air support or coordinate with other teams from halfway across the world. And there was him, the sniper, the quiet one, the one who would climb to the highest point he could find and lay there for hours, sometimes days, watching everything below through the glass of his scope, while the rest of the team moved through the danger below. His first weeks in country were spent learning the terrain. They went on patrol after patrol, walking through villages and markets and alleyways, getting to know the faces and the rhythms of the place. The locals looked at them with expressions that were hard to read. Some of them were grateful, some of them were afraid, some of them were hostile in a way that they tried to hide but could not quite keep out of their eyes. And some of them were the enemy wearing the same clothes and the same expressions as everyone else. That was the hardest part. Not knowing who wanted to shake your hand and who wanted to kill you. Not knowing if the man smiling at you from the doorway was a farmer or a fighter. Not knowing if the child waving at you from the road had a bomb strapped to his chest. He learned to watch. He had always been good at watching. But now he learned to watch in a way that could save lives. He learned to read body language from 1,000 yards away. He learned to spot the tiny details that most people would miss. The way a man's hand moved toward his waist. The way a woman walked too fast through an empty street. The way a car sat too low on its wheels because it was loaded with something heavy. He learned to see the patterns in the chaos, the order hidden inside the disorder, the danger buried beneath the ordinary. And his team started to rely on him for this. Before every mission, they would ask him what he saw. Before every move, they would wait for his word. He was their eyes. He was their guardian angel, perched on a rooftop with a rifle and a radio. His first real engagement came on a Tuesday afternoon. He remembered it was a Tuesday because that morning his mother had sent him a letter that arrived with the weekly mail delivery, and she had written the date at the top the way she always did. He had read the letter sitting on his bunk and then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. And then the alarm went off and everything changed. His team was sent to support a convoy that had been ambushed on a road outside a small village. By the time they got there, the situation was chaos. Vehicles were burning, men were screaming on the radio, bullets were coming from multiple directions, and nobody could tell exactly where the enemy was. His team leader pointed to a building on the edge of the road, a 3-story structure with a flat roof, and told him to get up there and find the shooters. He ran. He ran through open ground with bullets snapping past his head, the sound like angry wasps buzzing by his ears. He reached the building and went through the door and up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his rifle bouncing against his back, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He reached the roof and dropped to his belly and crawled to the edge and set up his rifle and looked through his scope. The world below opened up to him like a map. He could see the burning vehicles. He could see the wounded men trying to crawl to cover. He could see the muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, small bursts of light in the shadows of doorways and windows and behind walls. He counted them. 6. No, 7. 7 shooters spread out across a 200-yard line, firing from concealed positions. His team was pinned down behind a damaged vehicle, and they could not move without being hit. He took a breath. He let it out slowly. He felt his heartbeat in his finger on the trigger. And then he did what he had been trained to do. He picked the most dangerous target first, a man with a machine gun positioned on a rooftop across the road. The man was pouring fire down on the convoy and the heavy rounds were tearing through the vehicles like paper. He put his crosshairs on the man's chest. He waited for the space between heartbeats, and he squeezed the trigger. The man dropped. 1 second he was firing his weapon and the next second he was gone, like someone had flipped a switch. No dramatic fall. No slow motion, just there and then, not there. And the machine gun went silent. He did not have time to think about what he had just done. He shifted his rifle to the next target, a man leaning out of a window with a rocket launcher on his shoulder, aiming at one of the vehicles where wounded men were sheltering. He put his crosshairs on the man and squeezed the trigger, and the man crumpled backward into the room, and the rocket launcher fell from the window and clattered to the street below. He worked his way through the targets one by one, calm, steady, patient, each shot precise, each shot deliberate, each shot exactly where it needed to be. By the time he fired his sixth round, the enemy fire had dropped to almost nothing. The remaining shooters realized that someone was picking them off from above, and they started to pull back, disappearing into the alleys and doorways like smoke. His team moved forward. The convoy was secured. The wounded were evacuated. And when it was over, his team leader looked up at the rooftop where he was still lying and gave him a thumbs up over the radio. That night, back at the base, the team gathered in their quarters and talked about the engagement. They talked about the ambush, the confusion, the fear, the relief, and for the first time they talked about him differently. Not as the quiet guy, not as the boring one, but as the man who had saved their lives. His team leader came over to him and sat down and looked at him for a long time, and then said two words that meant more to him than any medal or any promotion ever would. He said, "Thank you." But the war was not over. It was barely beginning, and the missions got harder and more dangerous as the weeks turned into months. They were sent deeper and deeper into hostile territory. They were sent to places where the roads ended and the mountains began. They were sent to hunt men who had been fighting wars since before they were born. Men who knew every rock and every cave and every path through those mountains like they knew their own hands. And he went with them every time, climbing to the highest point, finding his position, settling in, and watching. There was one mission that changed everything. They were sent to a valley that intelligence said was being used as a supply route by the enemy. The plan was simple. His team would set up an observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley and watch for enemy movement. When they spotted the supply convoy, they would call in an airstrike and destroy it. Simple on paper. Nothing is simple in war. They hiked for 2 days to reach the ridge. The terrain was brutal. Loose rocks and steep inclines and thin air that made every step feel like 10. They carried everything on their backs: weapons, ammunition, food, water, communication equipment, medical supplies. By the time they reached the ridge, they were exhausted, but they set up their position and settled in to wait. He found a spot on the edge of the ridge with a clear view of the valley below. He built a small hide out of rocks and brush, just big enough for him and his spotter to lie side by side. His spotter was a man named Davis, a wiry, red-haired man from Montana who talked too much when he was nervous, which was most of the time. Davis was a good spotter, though. He had sharp eyes and a quick mind, and he could calculate wind speed and distance and elevation faster than anyone else on the team. They lay in their hide and watched. The first day passed with nothing. The second day passed with nothing. The third day, the sun beat down on them so hard that the rocks around them were too hot to touch and their water was running low. Davis whispered that maybe the intelligence was wrong. Maybe there was no supply convoy. Maybe they were lying on this ridge, baking in the sun for nothing. He did not respond. He just watched, because he knew something that Davis did not know yet. He knew that patience was not just a virtue for a sniper. It was the whole point. On the fourth day, just before dawn, he saw movement in the valley. It was subtle, just a flicker of shadow against the grey rocks. But he saw it because he had been staring at those rocks for 3 days and he knew every shape and every shadow, and this one was new. He tapped Davis on the shoulder and pointed, and Davis raised his binoculars and looked, and then his eyes went wide. It was not a supply convoy. It was something much bigger. An entire column of enemy fighters was moving through the valley. Not 10 or 20, dozens, maybe 100 or more. They were moving in a long, spread-out line, using the terrain for cover, moving quickly and quietly in the way that experienced fighters move. And they were heading straight toward a forward operating base where hundreds of coalition soldiers were stationed. If that column reached the base, it would be a massacre. He got on the radio and reported what he saw. The response came back almost immediately. There were no aircraft available for an airstrike. They were all committed to other operations. The nearest quick reaction force was hours away. His team was on their own. 8 men against 100, and the column was moving fast. His team leader made a decision. They would engage, not to win. That was impossible. But to slow the column down long enough for the base to be warned and reinforcements to arrive. They would fight a delaying action from the ridge, using the high ground and their superior training to hold the enemy in place for as long as possible. It was dangerous. It was possibly suicidal. But there was no other choice. They spread out along the ridge and took up positions. He stayed in his hide with Davis beside him. His team leader gave him the order to start the engagement. He was to fire the first shot. He was to pick the most important target he could find and take it out, and that would be the signal for the rest of the team to open fire. He looked through his scope at the column below. He scanned the line of fighters, looking for leaders, looking for the men who were giving orders, the men who the others looked to for direction. And he found one, a tall man near the middle of the column, who moved with authority and gestured to the fighters around him. He was the one. He put his crosshairs on the man's chest. He took a breath. He let it out. He felt the stillness come over him, that deep, perfect stillness that he had carried inside him since he was a boy sitting on a fallen tree in the woods behind his house. And he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder. The tall man dropped and the column froze. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. And then the ridge erupted with gunfire as his entire team opened up at once. What followed was the longest 4 hours of his life. The enemy recovered quickly from the shock of the first shots and began to organize. They took cover behind rocks and in dry riverbeds and started to return fire. They tried to flank the ridge from both sides. They tried to rush straight up the slope, and every time they moved, he was there, watching. Waiting, firing. He lost count of how many shots he took that day. He fired until his barrel was so hot he could see the heat waves rising from it. He fired until his shoulder was bruised black from the recoil. He fired until his eyes burned from staring through the scope without blinking. And every shot counted. Every shot hit. Every shot stopped a man who was trying to kill his brothers. Davis was beside him the whole time, calling out distances and wind corrections and target locations. They worked together like a single organism, like two halves of the same brain. Davis would spot a threat and call it out, and he would shift his rifle and fire, and the threat would disappear. Over and over and over again. But the enemy kept coming, and his team was taking fire, heavy fire. He heard the calls on the radio. One of his teammates was hit, then another. The medic was working frantically, moving from one wounded man to another, trying to keep them alive while bullets kicked up dirt all around him. His team leader was screaming into the radio, calling for support, calling for anyone who could help. And then the worst moment came. A rocket exploded against the rocks just below his hide. The blast threw dirt and stone into the air, and the shockwave hit him like a wall. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Davis grabbed his arm and shouted something he could not hear. He shook his head to clear it, and looked through his scope and saw that the enemy was making a coordinated push up the slope. 30 or 40 fighters moving together, using covering fire to advance. If they reached the ridge, it was over. He did something in that moment that he had never done before. He did not think. He did not calculate. He did not wait for the space between heartbeats. He just fired, again and again and again. Fast and precise and relentless. He fired like a machine, like something that was not quite human anymore. Like the rifle was part of his body and the bullets were extensions of his will. And the push faltered. The fighters at the front of the charge went down, and the ones behind them stumbled over them, and the momentum broke. They fell back. They retreated to cover. And the ridge held. The reinforcements arrived. 2 hours later, helicopters thundered over the valley, and troops poured out, and the enemy scattered into the mountains. When it was over, his team leader walked over to his hide and looked at him lying there in the dirt and dust and spent brass casings and said nothing for a long time. Then he reached down and grabbed his hand and pulled him to his feet and held him in a hug that was so tight it hurt. And the team leader was crying, not sobbing, just quiet tears running down his dusty face, because he knew what had happened on that ridge. He knew that without the man standing in front of him, none of them would have made it off that mountain. They went back to base, and the wounded were taken to the hospital, and the debriefings began. Reports were written, numbers were counted, and the numbers were staggering. In 4 hours of continuous engagement, he had fired over 60 confirmed shots. The body count attributed to his rifle alone was something that senior officers read twice because they did not believe it the first time. A colonel came to talk to the team and listened to the account and shook his head slowly and said he had never heard of anything like it in his entire career. But here was the thing that nobody outside the military would understand. He did not feel like a hero. He did not feel proud. He felt empty. He felt tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He felt like something had been taken out of him on that ridge, something that he would never get back. He had killed men. A lot of men. And even though those men had been trying to kill him and his team and hundreds of soldiers at the forward base, he felt the weight of it. Every single one. He carried them like stones in his chest, and they were heavy. And they would never get lighter. His team treated him differently after that day. They did not mock him anymore. Nobody called him boring or weird. They looked at him with something in their eyes that was hard to describe. It was not fear exactly, though there was a little of that. It was not worship, though there was a little of that too. It was something deeper. It was the look that men give to another man when they know that he has done something extraordinary, something that goes beyond skill and training and enters the territory of something else entirely, something that does not have a name. Word spread beyond his team. Other units heard about the engagement on the ridge. Other snipers heard about the shot count. Senior officers began to take an interest in this quiet man from a small town who had held off an entire enemy column with a rifle and a spotter and nothing else. His name started to appear in reports and briefings and classified documents, and somewhere in a building far away from the dust and the mountains and the blood, a Navy SEAL Admiral read one of those reports and circled his name with a pen and wrote a note in the margin that simply said, "Find out more about this man." But he did not know any of this. He did not know that people were talking about him. He did not know that his name was being passed around at levels far above his rank. All he knew was that the war continued and the missions continued, and every day he climbed to his position and watched through his scope and did his job. And the weight in his chest got heavier with every mission. And the fire inside him burned brighter with every mission. And the boy who had sat on a fallen tree in the woods and watched the deer was becoming something that even he did not fully recognize when he looked in the mirror. The next months blurred together in a haze of missions and engagements and sleepless nights. He went on operations that he would never be allowed to talk about. He was sent to places that did not officially exist on any map. He worked with teams from agencies whose names were never spoken out loud. And through it all, he did what he did best. He watched, he waited, he fired, and he hit. There were moments of humanity in between the missions. Moments when he sat with his team and they laughed about something stupid. Moments when he read letters from his mother and his sister. Moments when Davis told some ridiculous story from his childhood in Montana, and everyone groaned and threw things at him. These moments were precious because they reminded him that he was still a person, still a human being, still the boy from the small town with the leaking roof, but those moments were getting fewer and farther between. The war was eating them away, one mission at a time, the way the river eats the bank. And then came the mission that would bring everything to a breaking point, the mission that would test him in ways that no training could prepare for. The mission that would push him to the very edge of what a human being can endure and force him to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. The mission that would eventually lead him to a room full of the most elite warriors on the planet, where a SEAL Admiral would do something that nobody in that room had ever seen before. But that part of the story was still ahead of him. And between here and there was still a long road of pain and sacrifice and doubt and fear, a road that he would walk alone, the way he had always walked alone. Quiet, invisible, and absolutely unstoppable. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room underground. The walls were covered with maps and satellite photographs and timelines written in red marker. There were more officers in the room than he had ever seen gathered in one place. Men with stars on their shoulders and ribbons on their chests and hard eyes that had seen decades of war between them. He sat in the back of the room the way he always sat in the back, quiet and still and watching. And he listened as the briefing officer laid out the operation. A high-value target had been located in a compound deep inside enemy territory. This was not an ordinary target. This was a man who had planned and organized attacks that had killed hundreds of people, including dozens of coalition soldiers. Intelligence agencies had been hunting him for years. He had escaped every previous attempt to capture or kill him. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few hours, surrounded by fighters who were loyal to the point of fanaticism. But now, for the first time, they had solid intelligence on his location. He was in a compound at the base of a mountain range, and he would be there for 48 hours for a meeting with other leaders. The window of opportunity was narrow. If they missed it, he would disappear again and more people would die. The plan was complex, a joint operation involving multiple teams from different branches. Ground forces would approach the compound from two directions. Helicopters would provide air support. Electronic warfare teams would jam enemy communications, and there would be a sniper team positioned on a ridge overlooking the compound to provide overwatch and, if necessary, to take the shot that would end the target's life. He knew before anyone said his name that this was his mission. The commanding officer turned to him and said they wanted the best, and based on everything they had seen and everything they had read and everything his team leader had reported, he was the best. He nodded. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. This was what he had been trained for. This was what all of it had been building toward. Every Saturday morning with his father, every hour in the training facility, every shot on every mission in every dusty corner of this broken country. It all led to this. They spent 2 days planning. Every detail was examined and re-examined. Every possible scenario was played out. Every contingency was prepared for. He studied the terrain around the compound until he could close his eyes and see it in perfect detail. He studied the compound itself, every building, every wall, every door and window and rooftop. He studied the target, his face, his height, the way he walked, the clothes he typically wore. He studied everything because that was what he did. He prepared for the shot the way a surgeon prepares for an operation, with total focus and total precision and total commitment. Davis would be with him again as his spotter. They had not been apart for a single mission since the day on the ridge, and they had developed a bond that went beyond friendship. It was the bond of two men who had kept each other alive through things that most people could not imagine. They did not need to talk much anymore. A glance, a tap on the shoulder, a small nod. That was enough. They understood each other the way two instruments in the same orchestra understand each other, each one knowing exactly when to play and when to be silent. They inserted by helicopter 2 nights before the operation. The flight was long and low and fast, the helicopter skimming the tops of the mountains in the darkness, the pilots flying with night vision goggles and no lights. They landed in a dry riverbed 3 miles from the compound and hiked the rest of the way in the dark. The terrain was treacherous, loose scree and steep drops and paths that were barely wider than a boot. They moved slowly and carefully, carrying everything they needed on their backs, making no sound, leaving no trace. They reached the ridge before dawn and set up their position. It was a good spot, a natural depression in the rock that gave them cover and concealment and a clear line of sight to the compound below. The distance was just over 1,200 yards, a long shot but well within his capability. The wind was steady from the east, about 8 miles per hour. The elevation difference between his position and the compound was significant, which would affect the trajectory of the bullet. Davis began calculating immediately, scribbling numbers in a small notebook, checking and rechecking his math. They settled in and waited. The compound below was quiet. A few guards moved along the walls, but there was no sign of the target yet. According to the intelligence, the meeting was scheduled for the following day. They had a full day and night to wait. A full day and night of lying on hard rock, barely moving, barely eating, barely sleeping. A full day and night of watching and waiting and thinking. And he thought about a lot of things during those hours. He thought about his father and the way he had handed him that old rifle for the first time. He thought about the sound the tin can had made when it flew off the fence post. He thought about the drill instructor who had written that note on his clipboard. He thought about the old instructor who had told him that his stillness was a gift. He thought about the ridge and the 4 hours of continuous fire and the weight of the stones in his chest. He thought about all the people who had laughed at him and ignored him and told him he was nothing special. And he thought about the men he had killed and the faces he could still see when he closed his eyes, and the way those faces would never go away no matter how many years passed. Davis lay beside him, and for once, Davis was not talking. The gravity of the mission had silenced even him. They lay together in their hide and watched the compound and waited for the world to change. The next morning, activity at the compound increased. Vehicles began arriving in the early hours. Men got out and went inside. Guards were doubled at every position. The meeting was happening. He felt a shift inside himself, a tightening, a focusing, like a lens being adjusted until the image becomes perfectly sharp. He put his eye to his scope and watched every movement below with an intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. Hours passed. The meeting was taking place inside the main building, and he could not see inside. He watched the doors and the windows and the courtyard, and he waited. Davis monitored the radio, listening to the other teams checking in, confirming their positions, confirming their readiness. Everything was in place. The ground forces were hidden in their positions. The helicopters were on standby. The electronic warfare teams were ready to jam. All they needed was the target to step outside. And then, just after noon, the door of the main building opened and men began to come out. His heart rate increased slightly and he forced it back down. He watched through his scope as figure after figure emerged into the courtyard. And then he saw him. The target, walking out of the building, surrounded by 4 bodyguards, talking to another man beside him, gesturing with his hands the way he did in the surveillance photographs. He was wearing a dark jacket and light-colored pants, and he moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He put his crosshairs on the man. Davis was whispering numbers in his ear: wind speed, distance, elevation correction, temperature, humidity. All the tiny factors that would affect the flight of the bullet over 1,200 yards of open air. He made his adjustments. Tiny clicks on the scope that shifted the crosshairs by fractions of an inch that would translate to feet at the target distance. He settled the crosshairs on the man's upper chest. He took a breath. He began to let it out. And then the target stopped walking. He turned and looked back at the building. One of his bodyguards moved in front of him, partially blocking the shot. The target said something, and the bodyguard stepped aside, and for a moment there was a clear line. But the target was moving again, turning, walking toward a vehicle parked at the edge of the courtyard. If he got in that vehicle and drove away, the mission was over. The window was closing. Davis whispered the word steady. Just that one word. Steady. He tracked the target with his crosshairs. The man was walking at a slight angle now, moving toward the vehicle. The distance was still 1,200 yards. The wind had shifted slightly, now coming from the southeast. Davis called the new correction and he adjusted. The crosshairs settled on the man's torso. He had maybe 3 seconds before the man reached the vehicle door and disappeared behind it. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The bullet left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It traveled across 1,200 yards of open air in just over 1 second. It cut through the wind and the heat and the dust, and it found its target. The man stumbled. He took one more step, and then his legs gave out and he fell forward onto the ground and did not move. The courtyard erupted in chaos. Bodyguards scrambled. Men shouted and ran in different directions. Gunfire cracked from the guard positions as they fired wildly at the surrounding hills, not knowing where the shot had come from. And then the ground forces moved in, and the helicopters came roaring over the ridge, and the operation unfolded exactly the way it had been planned. He lay in his hide and watched through his scope as the compound was secured. He watched as the ground forces moved through the buildings, clearing each one. He watched as the target was confirmed. He watched as the other leaders who had been at the meeting were captured. He watched all of it with the same stillness that he had carried his whole life. And when it was over, when the compound was quiet and the smoke had cleared and the radio was full of voices confirming success, he set down his rifle and rolled onto his back and looked up at the sky and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt nothing. Not relief, not pride, not satisfaction, nothing. Just emptiness. Just the sound of his own breathing and the blue sky above him and the weight of another life added to the stones in his chest. Davis looked at him and understood and said nothing. They packed their gear in silence and began the long hike back to the extraction point. The weeks after the mission were a blur of debriefings and reports and classified meetings. He told his story again and again to different people at different levels. He pointed at maps and drew diagrams and answered questions about wind speed and distance and timing. He did it all with the same quiet patience that he brought to everything. And then it was over. And he was told he was going home. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth. He had been gone for so long that he was not sure he knew what home meant anymore. He was not the same person who had shipped out on that cold spring morning. He was harder. He was quieter, which he had not thought was possible. He carried things inside him that he could not talk about, things that woke him up in the middle of the night with his heart racing and his hands reaching for a rifle that was not there. He flew back to the United States and there was no parade, no crowd of people cheering, no cameras or reporters. He stepped off the plane and got on a bus and went to the base, and that was it. He was back. The war was still going on, but his part of it was done for now. He went to his barracks and sat on his bunk and looked at the wall and felt like a stranger in his own country, but something was happening that he did not know about. While he had been lying on ridges and rooftops in distant mountains, His story had been moving through the military community like a quiet wind. The reports from the Ridge battle had been read and reread by senior officers. The classified account of the compound mission had reached the highest levels of Special Operations Command, and a Navy SEAL Admiral, a man who had spent his entire career surrounded by the most elite warriors in the world, a man who had seen and done things that would never be written in any book. This Admiral had read everything, and had decided that there was something about this young man that demanded personal recognition. He was told on a Thursday morning that he was to report to a building on the other side of the base at 1400 hours. He was told to wear his dress uniform. He was not told why. He ironed his uniform and polished his boots and looked at himself in the mirror and saw a face that looked older than it should have. He walked across the base in the afternoon sun and entered the building and was led down a hallway to a large conference room. When the door opened, he stopped. The room was full of men. Not just any men. These were operators, Special Forces, SEALs, Delta, Rangers. The most decorated, most experienced, most dangerous warriors in the United States military. They sat in chairs arranged in rows, facing a small stage at the front of the room. And on that stage, standing behind a podium, was the Admiral. He had never seen so many medals and ribbons in one place. The Admiral was tall and grey-haired and had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were sharp and blue, and they locked onto him the moment he walked through the door. He was led to a chair in the front row, and he sat down, and he did not know what was happening, and his heart was beating faster than it had during any firefight. The Admiral began to speak. He spoke about service and sacrifice. He spoke about the men and women who put on the uniform and go to the places that most people would run from. He spoke about courage. Not the loud kind that people see in movies, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up at 4 in the morning on a cold ridge in hostile territory. The kind that lies still for hours and days, watching and waiting, while every cell in the body screams to move, to run, to hide. The kind that squeezes a trigger knowing that the sound will give away your position and that every enemy fighter within a mile will be coming for you. And then the Admiral said his name. He said it clearly and firmly and with a respect that filled the room like sound fills a cathedral. He told the room about the ridge. He told them about the 4-hour engagement. He told them about the 60 confirmed shots. He told them about the compound mission and the 1,200-yard shot that ended a man who had killed hundreds. He told them things that he himself did not know were in any report. Details about other missions, other moments, other shots that had saved lives in ways that he had never been told about. The room was silent. These men, these warriors who had seen everything and done everything, sat in complete silence and listened. And he sat in his chair in the front row and felt something rising inside him that he could not control. It was not pride. It was not ego. It was something else. Something that felt like every single moment of his life was converging on this point. Every insult he had swallowed. Every laugh he had absorbed. Every time someone had looked through him like he was not there. Every Saturday morning with his father, every hour in the woods being still, every shot fired in anger and in fear and in duty, all of it was rushing toward this moment like a river rushing toward the sea. The Admiral finished speaking. He stepped out from behind the podium, and then he did something that made every person in that room hold their breath. He walked down from the stage. He walked directly to the front row. He stood in front of the chair where the quiet man from the small town was sitting. And the Admiral, a 4-star Admiral of the United States Navy, a man who commanded some of the most lethal forces on Earth, straightened his back and lifted his right hand and saluted him. He saluted him before anyone else in the room could react, before any of the other warriors could stand or clap or do anything at all. The Admiral saluted first. In the military, protocol says that the lower-ranking person salutes first and the higher-ranking person returns it. But in this room, on this day, the Admiral broke protocol. He saluted first because he wanted everyone in that room to understand something. He wanted them to understand that rank and medals and titles do not measure a man. That sometimes the most extraordinary warrior is the one nobody notices. That sometimes the quietest voice carries the loudest truth. That sometimes the man they mock as just another sniper is the man who saves them all. The room exploded. Every man in that room, every SEAL, every Delta operator, every Ranger, every Special Forces warrior, they all stood up at once, and the sound of their applause was like thunder. They clapped and they shouted, and some of them slammed their hands on the tables, and some of them stamped their feet on the floor, and the noise shook the walls of that room. And he sat there in his chair with the Admiral standing in front of him, saluting, and the tears came. He could not stop them. He did not try. They ran down his face and dropped onto his pressed uniform, and he let them come because they had been waiting a very long time. He stood up slowly. He stood up and he returned the Admiral's salute, and the two men stood there, face to face, hand to brow, in a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but that carried the weight of an entire life. The Admiral lowered his hand, and then he reached out and took the young man's hand in both of his and held it, and leaned in close and said something that only the two of them could hear. The words were private, and they would remain private, because some things are too sacred to be shared with the world. But whatever the Admiral said, it broke something open inside the young man's chest, something that had been locked tight for years, something that all the training and the discipline and the control could not keep sealed any longer. After the ceremony, men came up to him, one by one. These hardened, decorated warriors shook his hand and looked him in the eye and gave him the thing he had been denied his entire life. They saw him, not just his skill, not just his shot count, not just the missions and the reports and the numbers. They saw him, the person, the boy from the small town who nobody noticed, the kid who sat in the back of the classroom, the recruit who nobody talked to, the trainee they called boring. They saw all of it, and they honored all of it, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel invisible. He went home after that. Not to another deployment. Not to another mission. Home. To the small town with the cracked roads and the cold winters. His mother met him at the door and held him the way she had held him when he was small. And she did not ask any questions because she could see in his eyes that he had been to places that words could not reach. His father shook his hand and then pulled him into a hug that was awkward and stiff because they were not a hugging family, but it lasted longer than it should have, and that said everything. His sister was there. She had finished college and was working as a teacher now. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and told him she was proud of him. His brother was there too, quieter than he used to be, working still at the factory. And he clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Welcome home, brother," and his voice cracked when he said it. He stood in the backyard that evening and looked at the woods where he used to sit on the fallen tree. The tree was still there, older and more rotted than before, but still there. He walked over to it and sat down the way he used to sit when he was a boy. He looked at the trees and the sky and the birds and the squirrels, and he was still, perfectly, completely, absolutely still. And in that stillness, for the first time in years, he felt something that was not emptiness and was not weight and was not pain. He felt peace. He would carry the stones in his chest for the rest of his life. He knew that. The faces would never go away. The sounds would never fully fade. The nightmares would come and go like storms, some worse than others, some barely more than a whisper in the dark. He would struggle with it. He would have days when getting out of bed felt like the hardest mission he had ever been on. He would have nights when the silence of his bedroom was louder than any gunfire. He would fight this war inside himself for years, and it would be the hardest fight of all. But he would also have this, the memory of that room, the memory of the Admiral's salute, the memory of those warriors standing and clapping and seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. He would carry that too, and on the darkest nights when the weight was heaviest and the fire inside him burned the hottest, he would close his eyes and go back to that moment and feel the tears on his face and the sound of the applause in his bones, and he would know that it was real, that he was real, that the boy nobody noticed had become the man nobody could forget. He never told his story publicly. He never wrote a book, or did interviews, or tried to become famous. That was not who he was. He remained the quiet man he had always been. He went on to help train the next generation of snipers, passing on everything he had learned, everything the old instructor had taught him, everything the war had carved into his soul. He taught them about breathing and wind and distance and elevation. But more than anything, he taught them about stillness. He told them that the most important thing a sniper carries is not his rifle. It is the silence inside him, the ability to shut out every noise, every fear, every doubt, every voice that says you are not enough, and become nothing but the mission. And sometimes, late at night, when the training was done and the students had gone to their barracks, he would walk outside and stand in the darkness and look up at the stars and think about all of it. The small town, the fallen tree, the tin cans on the fence post, The drill instructor's note, the ridge, the compound, the Admiral's salute. And he would shake his head slowly and smile, just a small, quiet smile, because it still amazed him, all of it. The whole impossible, painful, beautiful journey from the boy that nobody saw to the man that a room full of legends stood up to honor. He was just another sniper. That is what they had called him, just another sniper. And maybe they were right in a way they never intended, because there is no such thing as just another sniper. Every man behind that scope has a story. Every man who lies still in the dirt and watches and waits and pulls the trigger carries a world inside him that nobody else will ever fully understand. And this man, this quiet, invisible, extraordinary man, carried a world bigger than most. The Admiral knew it. The warriors in that room knew it. And now, anyone who hears this story knows it too. Some people are born to be loud. Some people are born to fill the room with their presence and their voice and their energy. But some people, the rare ones, the special ones, are born to be still. And in that stillness they find a power that the loud ones will never understand. A power that can reach across 1,200 yards and change the course of history with a single breath. He was one of those people. The still ones, the quiet ones, the ones who sit in the back and watch. And he was, without question, one of the finest warriors who ever lived, not because of the shots he took, not because of the lives he saved, but because of who he was. A good man, a humble man, a man who never asked for recognition and received it anyway from the highest authority, in a room full of the best. Just another sniper. The words that were meant to diminish him became the words that defined him. Because he took those words and he swallowed them and he let them burn inside him and he used that fire to become something that the people who said them could never imagine. And in the end, it was not the bullet that made him legendary. It was the silence before it.